Okay, so we'll take a look real quickly at how the Industrial Revolution leads to major changes in families and society as a whole, specifically within industrialized towns, but then we'll also look at the changing role of science within society. Okay, so first, let's start out with the major social institution, kind of the bedrock of European society, and that is marriage. If you recall, through the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, marriage is an economic arrangement where people in the countryside are looking to acquire more land, make themselves better off. So they arrange marriages. It's not a romantic thing at all. And that really continues for the middle classes, where they view this marriage contract as a way to improve the social status of themselves and their children and their future generations. And so you see kind of dowries being produced by the parents of the wives or the wives' families. And you see these elaborate wedding procedures to maintain that kind of economic arrangement where everyone gets better. The two families improve their economic life. In the working class, though, it shifts really away from this economic arrangement and towards romance. And so you have people who young men and women who are working next to each other in factories or seeing each other in the cities. And so they begin to court each other rather than waiting for their parents to arrange these marriages. And so romance takes the stage. Now, marrying these people isn't going to improve their lot in life, but it's someone who they genuinely care about. And therefore, we start to see the kind of makings of modern romance. At the same time, we have this real rise in illegitimate births in the late 18th and early 19th century, and that's because society is trying to shift and adjust to new industrial and urban life. People are working near non-family members for the first time, and so they're interacting with the opposite sex in new ways, and this leads to a rise in illegitimate births, that is, children born before marriage. So we have that real shift socially, which shows the breakdown in family structure. Despite that, the family really remains an important player in everyone's life. Families generally are living near each other. You would have huge extended families living in the same neighborhoods, gathering for dinners and celebrations, really relying upon each other. And especially we see this with the working classes because life is so difficult that when people are unemployed or sick or get injured while working, they really rely on their extended family to help support them, whether that's taking them in or whatever that may be. You also see extended family working in childcare and things of that sort to take care of the whole family unit, looking at the extended family. So even though there are some major changes as it relates to romance and marriage, the family unit still plays a central role in European society. Gender roles also see major adjustments and shifts at this time. So before, where men and women generally did the same jobs and were economically equal, as the Industrial Revolution takes hold, we start to see some changes. So men become the major wage earners in factories and offices, and women stay home and they manage the household and care for the children. Now, this is a real shift. Before this, both men and women would work in the field in order to improve the economic life for the family. But now, in general, it's just men working. That is true across most classes. It's really only in the poorest people where women are expected to work. And this division of labor means that the middle-class women are really excluded from well-paying jobs. They're not going to go work in the factory lines, but they can't find clerical or office work because they're women and they're expected to stay home. So we see as this division of labor really takes hold, we see kind of sexism starting to take place and gender inequality is rising. And so we see women really lacking many basic rights. They have no legal identity at this time period, and that means they can't own property. So if their husbands died, that land would pass on to their sons, their husband's family, their husband's brother. I mean, it just doesn't go to the women. And this really leaves women in a really bad spot. As widows, they're unable to support themselves completely. And that really leads to some social breakdowns. So middle-class women begin to form organizations that push for three major things. First, just basic equal legal rights. Like, we need to be identified as legal entities, as legal people, so we can own land, so that we can inherit property, whether that's houses or land or whatever it may be, in order to sustain themselves if their families died. They also want access to higher education, like beyond just basic grade school or staying home. They want the right to learn and to become more educated. And that really pushes off, if you recall the name Mary Wollstonecraft, where she argued that the only really inequality was inequality of opportunity, and that women and men could do the same thing if women were afforded the same opportunities, specifically educationally. And then they want access to professional employment, because if women don't marry or if their husbands die, they need a way to sustain themselves, and they're not having that option. And so they begin to see some successes in the late 1800s where women are granted legal rights and are able to inherit property. But in terms of the other working and educational equality, that takes a lot longer before it comes through. We're talking into the 20th century. And although that's the middle class push, working class women are generally significantly more radical than the middle class women. They want radical reforms that would benefit everybody in the working class. And they do that because they are themselves at work. And so they're pushing for kind of Marxist ideas of more economic equality and things of that sort. So you have this divide in the kind of women's rights movement between the middle class and the working class. At this time, there's also a redefining of the role of children, and the concept of childhood really starts to develop in the late 1800s. Parents generally have more love and concern for their children, and that's in part because their children are actually surviving infancy and childhood, and so they're growing more and more attached to them. And there's also a recognition of the value of parenting and how difficult that is. So middle and upper class women move away from wet nurses and begin breastfeeding their own children and begin to take care of their own children rather than relying on peasant women to do that for them. Now, they still have servants and nannies of that sort, but there's recognition of the value of parenting. And because children are surviving more often and they are cared for more, women are generally having fewer children in order to take better care of the ones that they have. Children stop being an economic asset and begin being an economic liability, and that they cost a lot more than they bring in. So especially if you're middle class and you need to send your children to school and to various dance lessons or music lessons or whatever it may be, it costs them money to do that. And those children are not earning wages at that point. So you don't want to have 20 children or 15 children because it's going to cost you too much money. You want to have just a few. In addition, parents want to improve the economic and social positions for themselves and their children. If parents had to divide up their assets among 8 children, it's going to leave kind of all of them in tougher spots versus if just 1 or 2 children are around to divide up the assets. And there's also kind of this overbearing parenthood that begins at this time, and the charge is kind of led by Sigmund Freud, who is a name you may know from psychology, and he begins to talk about children's sexuality and the Oedipal complex. And there's really just kind of this overprotection, overbearing, kind of puritanical attitude towards children and their sexuality at this time. And that's a result really of this more care and concern for their children. So we kind of have that leading to this excessive concern about what children are doing at the time. In science, there's some pretty significant advances in a few fields. First, biology. Louis Pasteur and the kind of germ theory and pasteurization. That's one of those. There's, Darwin, you could argue, is in there as well. But there's some major advances in biology in the way that people recognize the world working around them. In physics, there's major growth in thermodynamics, which is a relationship between heat and energy. And we see that really in the steam engine and the improvements along the way, so that these factories are finding ways to harness more energy from their output of their steam engines. It's just trying to make these factories significantly more efficient than they originally were. In chemistry, Mendeleev and his other chemists are working towards developing the periodic table and really understanding organic chemistry and the building blocks of chem and of the world. So we have that going on. And meanwhile, in electricity, one of the major names, Faraday, is developing his theory of electromagnetism and really starting to recognize how electricity can work and benefit society as a whole. And we see that through electric streetcars, electric street lamps. And it really transforms the way that the world is lit and the way that the world is organized. And so these are some of just the major scientific fields that see massive leaps. And if you did scientific history, you could spend forever just researching any of these fields or any of these people. It's really a revolutionary time in the field of sciences. And because of that, there's some real major impacts, right? And the major consequences from these advances is that the everyday experiences of people show the importance of science. So you've got to imagine that if you were born in let's say 1850, and then you live to 1920, you live a nice good 70 years, and you see electricity at work, you start to grasp the importance of science and how much it could possibly benefit you. And so you really kind of are amazed and in awe of science. And so people begin to see that this is an important field that's worth studying. And that ties hand in hand with the next 2 points, is these scientific ideas and the Enlightenment ideas really allow people to believe that human progress is limitless, and people have faith in human progress. And that's because they see how much things are changing. People are living longer. They're understanding things better. They're able to predict things more. The quality of life is increasing because of these scientific advances. And people think, wow, look how far we've come in just 50 years, 60 years. Imagine how much further we can grow. And so people believe more in the concept of human progress, and they're realizing that science has value. And because of this, scientists gain more prestige. People honor them. They recognize their works and their importance and their contribution to society. And so science really becomes kind of a core subject within European mindset at this time. It's recognized as having definitive value and adding greatly to humans' experiences. And then branching off of this, from the hard sciences, we have the softer sciences, or the social scientists. And people try to apply this objective methods of science to study society. It's very, it should sound like a similar concept to what we've looked at before with the Enlightenment, but people are trying to understand society and really cast it in a scientific viewpoint. And so one of the main things that we see is the idea of evolution, and Jean-Baptiste Lamarck lays the foundation for evolution, and he begins to make these arguments for it. And very shortly thereafter comes Charles Darwin, and using Lamarck as his foundation, he continues the research, and on his sailing of the HMS Beagle, he creates the theory of natural selection and argues for this evolution over time, and weaker traits are eliminated from the gene pool, and the stronger will survive. And people are accepting this idea and implementing this and trying to fit this into their worldview. And some people decide to take this science and then apply it when they study society as a whole. And so they're arguing, like, why is society the way it is? Why are these working classes in such bad shape, and why are they so poor, and why is life so miserable for them? And people use Darwin's ideas to justify it. They say, well, they must be less evolved. Those must be the ones who are not the fittest. They are not the ones who will survive. The wealthy people are the strong ones who have those characteristics that naturally will be selected, while the weaker, the poorer people, will be weeded out of the gene pool. And it's really an awful and negative way to view society, and it's a way in which people who hold power like to view society, because it's a way for them to justify their power and their strength, while at the same time demeaning that of the people around them who are not as wealthy. And so you see kind of people manipulating and bastardizing Darwin's ideas while applying it to society. Not to humans, but to society as a whole. And so it kind of leads to some disdain for the poor. In art, we have a movement known as Realism, which is a rejection of the Romanticism that kind of took hold in the early 19th century. So Romanticism is a real brief blip on the artistic radar in the early 1800s, and Realism quickly replaces it. And their idea is that literature and art should depict life as it actually was, and not try to sugarcoat it, not try to idealize it, but just explain the way things actually were. And this begins in France, in large part because Romanticism never held much sway there. Most of the Romantics were not in France. They were elsewhere, in England and Germany and Austria and places like that. And so it takes hold there. And some of the major figures, and most of the realists come out in writing and literature. Émile Zola is well known. He's a Frenchman, and his writing as realism is very kind of shocking to people. They view it almost as grotesque and wildly inappropriate, and they find their sensibilities offended by his portrayal of life as it is. Marianne Evans writes under the pen name of George Eliot, and she writes in England. And then perhaps the most famous realist writer whose legacy lasts the longest is Leo Tolstoy, who's writing in Russia at the time and depicting really kind of the way things are. So realism kind of grows out of the actual experience of people in industrialized society and say, hey, let's not try to idealize or romanticize the way things are. Let's just depict things as it is, and let's show kind of the underbelly, the dark side of society. And that's how we have the realist movement take hold.